Do you want to stay more focused on the right goals in your life, or even just figure out what the right goals are for you? Do you want clarity? Do you want better work-life balance? Well, you're in the right place. Welcome to Success Through Failure.
Welcome to the Success Through Failure podcast, the show that reveals failure as your path to success. You'll listen to intriguing interviews with some of the most successful people on the planet and learn how their failures became a launchpad for success and how yours can too. Here's your host, former Division I All-American wrestler, former Division I head coach, speaker, and personal coach, Jim Harshaw.
Welcome to another episode of Success Through Failure. Today, I bring you Michael Bungay Stanier. Ever since I finished my career as a Division I All-American athlete, I longed for not only the clarity of purpose that I had as an athlete, but also the accountability that comes with aspiring for big goals with a team of like-minded people. Then I discovered mastermind groups. Masterminds are small groups of like-minded people who get together either in person or over Skype or just over the phone to provide support, feedback, and advice to other members of the group. So I dove in and I learned all I could about mastermind groups, and then I finally launched my own. And the change was instant. I regained the accountability of being part of a group of like-minded, hardworking individuals who hold me to a higher standard. My mastermind group helps me get feedback and advice and even validation when I'm making big decisions in my life. And I have clarity and focus and accountability again, just like when I was an athlete. I've now facilitated dozens of high performers in mastermind groups. I'm talking Olympians and MBAs and neurosurgeons and professional athletes and entrepreneurs and lots of others. I've taken everything you need to know to start your own mastermind group, and I put it into a short 10-page ebook titled The Quick and Easy Guide to Starting Your Own Mastermind Group in 30 Days or Less. Grab a copy of this free ebook by going to jimharshawjr.com/mastermind. That's jimharshawjr.com/mastermind. Michael is the senior partner at Box of Crayons, a company that helps organizations do less good work and more great work. He's the author of several books, including The Coaching Habit and Do More Great Work. Michael has written for or been featured in numerous publications, including Business Insider, Fast Company, Forbes, and the Huffington Post. Michael believes that coaching is an essential skill for leaders, but for most busy, overworked managers, coaching employees is done poorly or not at all. They're just too busy, and it's too hard to change. Michael believes that coaching should become a regular, informal part of a manager's day so that they and their teams can be more effective. At Box of Crayons, Michael and his team of facilitators help time-crunched managers coach in 10 minutes or less. You should know the drill by now for the listeners. If you don't have time to listen to this entire episode, if you hear something you like, but you don't have time to write it down, make sure you grab the free copy of this action plan. It's about a 3-page PDF of all the best good stuff from this episode and all the other episodes. Just go to jimharshawjr.com/action. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here. That's a nice introduction, so thank you for that.
Yeah, all good stuff. So right off your website, for the most part, you've done some incredible things. So before we get to what you're doing right now, Michael, let's talk a little bit about your background. Tell us, where you're from, where'd you grow up, how did you get to where you're at now?
What's great about that question is particularly in the context of this podcast, because I love your focus on, success really grows out of failure through, trying stuff out and stumbling here and stumbling there, collecting scars along the way. But normally when you get somebody to say, tell me who you are, where you come from, what you're going to hear is the kind of the edited highlights. Like here are my awards, here's my successes, here's all the things that appear to have worked. And I'll give you that. But one of the things I'm looking forward to is kind of unpicking some of that so I can show you the bruises and the stumbles I picked up on the way. But, the quick summary is that I'm Australian by birth. I grew up in Canberra. Canberra's the little-known national capital of Australia. Had a happy childhood, went to high school, university there. At university, I did an arts degree in literature, also a law degree. Finished my law degree actually being sued by one of my law lecturers for defamation.
Wow.
That could be a failure story for sure. But balancing that out is I was a Rhodes Scholar. I won the Rhodes Scholarship. On my second attempt, again, another story that we can dig into if it's useful.
Yeah.
And that had the blessing of taking me over to Oxford to study. And at Oxford, two great things happened. The first is I didn't become a lawyer because I'd have been a sad and largely useless lawyer. So that was good. Secondly, more importantly, I met my wife, Canadian, Marcella, to whom I'm still married. We've been married for about 24, 25 years now. And what that meant is I didn't hustle back to Australia, which was plan A, but I stayed in England a little longer while she finished a PhD. Got my first real kind of grown-up job, which was in the world of innovation and creativity. And again, there's some juicy stuff there as well if you want to get into it, Jim, because innovation is all about, what's the only way to innovate is to fail regularly. That right. Whole
Amen.
IDEO quote around fail faster to succeed sooner.
Yeah.
So spent time there inventing stuff, failing to invent stuff. And actually, it was the failure we were having in actually getting any of our good ideas launched that took me to a new company. It was about how does change actually happen in organizational life? Because, this innovation company, we kept lobbing really good ideas for new products and new services into the organization in intestines, and it just got kind of mushed up, and we never saw it again. There were too many great ideas that went in there to die. So spent time in this kind of change management consultant, and that's actually what took me from London, where we lived at the time, to Boston. Lived in Boston for 3 years, in part because my wife is a huge Boston Bruins fan. So for her, it was a kind of homecoming to hockey. I'm Australian, so I don't really understand ice hockey, as I call it.
I'm a Pittsburgh Penguins fan, so the Bruins and Penguins have a little bit of a rivalry.
They have a little bit of a history there. They sure do. And then about 2001, headed to Canada, Toronto, where we now live. We actually had flights out of Boston on 9/11. So that caused all sorts of things to happen because actually the job I had lined up in Toronto vanished because, everybody kind of panicked, rightly so. What's happening? Who's spending money? How are we going to make this work? And it meant that shortly after that, I set up Box of Crayons. And after a certain amount of kind of stumbling around and making stuff up, we kind of found our niche, which is just as you introduced us, helping busy managers and giving them the practical tools so they can coach in 10 minutes or less.
Man, so much to go off of there, Michael.
So many failures.
I hope you've got 2 hours blocked off.
Yeah.
So let's go. I've written a couple bullet points down here that I want to talk about. So you very much share and are open about your failures, and that's not the case with a lot of people. I mean, certainly it is with a good number of people on my show, but not even everybody on my show is really comfortable with sharing their failures. But you do it very publicly and right on your website, and I think it really makes you more credible, more authentic, more genuine, and more trustworthy because you do share some of those dark places, those dark spots on your resume. And so you got sued by your law teacher. Tell us about that. Let's hear about that one.
Well, it was a case of a little incident blowing up to be a big incident. So it was a law school teacher. He taught a certain type of law. He taught evidentiary law. And actually in the class he was teaching us, which was about some boring point of evidence law, the example he used was about a woman being raped. And there wasn't any real connection between having to use a woman being raped as the story to the piece of law that was being taught. And it just felt a bit gratuitous, a bit kind of offensive and upsetting for people. So I stuck up my hand and having discussed it with some other people, made a point about it in class, and it all went rapidly downhill from there. So we actually went and talked to the dean of the law school and said, how do we make a formal complaint about this? Because it's just, we just want him to use a different type of example rather than this particular one.
Sure.
But he used that as a claim that this was defamatory to him, and so he sued us, and everybody panicked, and it ended up in newspapers around the world. And it was an interesting moment. It taught me a couple of things. The first is, just how law works a little bit. I was naive, I would say, and optimistic, and kind of thought that law was about justice and truth and the right winning out over the bad. But that was a really interesting example about how the legal system is actually how it can be used for power. How it can be used to manipulate, how it can be used to quieten people. And so that was an eye-opener for me. The other thing that it really taught me is just about what it takes to make successful change happen. And again, if I look back on it now, I would say that I was a little strident, a little naive about how I went about protesting this particular thing. I still think it was the right thing to do. But, the way we did that was we made everybody lose face. Like everybody lost in that conversation. There's a place, I think, for holding people accountable and doing that. But the way I think real change happens is actually for you to get more subtle about the politics that are going on and understand where the levers of influence really lie. And I was just a bit stupid about that. So I'm glad to have made the stand around it. But if I had my time over again, I would just come at it in a slightly smarter way, in a way that didn't challenge him in front of everybody else. And by doing that, he kind of had to make a stand. And by making a stand, he had to escalate it to this. And, it just went kind of horribly wrong from there.
Interesting. So initially I was going to say I don't really categorize that as a failure. You spoke up about something that was meaningful to you and obviously others. And I mean, so maybe the failure there is that, you may or may not have gotten the outcome that you wanted, but you really learned something. And that ties in a little bit to something else you said. You worked for a company where, there were a lot of great ideas and you threw them into the company and too many ideas went there to die. And now you're talking about how successful change can happen. How does successful change happen? And I think this works for companies, but I think this also works for, if it's a teacher listening or a school administrator or a sports coach or a parent or anybody else who is part of an organization, which is everybody. I think it's relevant too. So how do you take that lesson and apply it to other things? And how do you make good change ideas happen. Stick? And how do you make good change happen?
Yeah, the short answer is really hard. It's really hard. Yeah. It fails more often than not. I mean, there's a pretty stunning statistics I read about this, but I know there's more about corporate change, but corporations, organizations are always launching big change programs. We need to change the way our culture works. We need to launch new stuff. And when I spend some real time in this field and I looked at the statistics, it said something like 11% of big change programs were actually successful. Only 11 success, 1 in 10. 40 to 50% made a little progress, but was a bit disappointing as to the original goals. And 40%, maybe 40 to 50% actually made no real progress and just deepened employee cynicism and cost a whole lot of money as well and a lot of time. That's 4 years of my life I'm never going to get back. So it is really hard to make change happen. And there's no kind of set answer to how to do it. But I've got some principles that I think that really help. The first is to understand that what you're dealing with is a complex system rather than a complicated system. And it's a bit jargony, so I'll tease the two of them apart. A complicated system is how you might think of as a space shuttle. It's hard to get a space shuttle up into space, go to the moon, whatever it is. But, if you follow all the instructions, if you tighten all the nuts and bolts, if you put in the O-rings, if you do all of that stuff, the odds are that you'll get the thing up into space because it's a complicated thing, but it's kind of linear. You pull this lever, that happens. You press that button, this happens. You push that thing and the other thing happens. It's dictated by the laws of physics. Complex works instead of on rules, more on principles. And the example that is often given is raising a child, or sometimes more tangibly, one of those flocks of birds that you've seen. They call them a murmuration, where you see swallows kind of swirling in the air and they create these amazing shapes. Yeah. And when those birds are flying, they don't have a very complicated to-do list taped to their wing going, turn left here, turn right there, follow this, pull this lever. They actually operate off three core principles. The principles are fly as close to the other bird as possible. Secondly, fly towards the center. Thirdly, don't run into any other birds. And you can see that there's a kind of tension between those principles, flying into the center, fly close to other birds, not running into other birds. You have to kind of make judgment calls all the way around how to fly to show up around that. And most of our systems that we live in, be it a school, be it an administration, be an organization, be a family, they're complex. It's not a simple, if I pull this lever, this will happen. But most people approach the change piece that's the way it's going to work. So that's an initial distinction, which is just to understand it's a whole lot harder to kind of set up a mechanical response to change happening. The second thing that might be useful to share is something I took from a great book called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath.
Yeah, great book.
And it is a great book. And they have a metaphor in there, which I think they took from somebody else, but no matter. It's basically the story of a man on an elephant walking along a path. And for them, this is a metaphor of change. The man on the elephant is the rational case for change. The elephant is the emotional driver of change, and the path is the environment that shapes the change. And all the focus is on the guy on top of the elephant. It's like, there it is, they're in control of the elephant, they're steering it happening. But the truth is that's a pretty tentative sense of control it's got. And that's true of change as well. We put a lot of emphasis on kind of making the rational case for change. And honestly, the rational case for change typically makes absolutely no difference whatsoever as to whether people are going to change or not. The emotional case for change is much more powerful. That kind of what's in it for me. You're going to kind of connect with people's heart to make a difference. And that's the elephant. And in that metaphor, if the elephant decides to go off the path, the elephant's going to go off the path. But actually, in so many ways, the environment of change is actually the biggest influencer, because it's the path that directs the elephant, that kind of sets the destination. When you tell your story of wrestling and the failures before you won that final match, part of what shaped you is not just the rational case and the emotional case for change, but on that third attempt, I'm guessing, is you going, right, here are the things I need to set up in my environment to make sure I have run the number of miles, I have stretched, I have practiced, I have done all of that.
Yeah, I actually call it, I have a name for that. I call it the environment of excellence, and it's something that I teach in my program. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. So you nailed it, which is you can stand in front of somebody and go, let me give you a PowerPoint slide with the 93 reasons why being excellent is a good thing. Or you could say to somebody going, look, let me get you to feel what excellent would be like, what the impact would be, how that would change your life if you could aspire to and achieve excellence. Or you could say, let me show you how to set up an environment which just directs you towards a level of excellence that you're dreaming of. And when you get all three of those things together, then you've got something really powerful going on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very well put. I mean, change is hard, and if you follow those three things, you can at least wrap your head around it much more confidently. And now, Michael, how does this connect to coaching? Because coaching is, I really like your book, The Coaching Habit, and I think a lot of people don't realize the power of coaching and how organizational and certainly individual change can come about through coaching. But why do managers need to coach?
Well, it's probably useful just to define our terms just briefly, because when you say coaching, there's a whole bunch of baggage arrives with that. I mean, I know a lot of athletes and ex-athletes listen to the show, so they're thinking perhaps of sports coaches. Some people may be in organizational life, so they've heard about the whole coaching thing that goes on in organizations. And some people have come across life coaches, and so maybe are scarred for life about meeting a life coach or not. Who knows? So people have all sorts of baggage about, this is what I think we're talking about. I've got a really simple way of thinking about what coaching is. And the first is, I guess it's twofold. The first is to actually go, look, I'm not trying to turn anybody into a coach. I just want people to be more coach-like. It's a real distinction between a kind of label this is a profession, and more of a way of how do we show up and be with each other. And when people go, well, okay, what does it mean to be more coach-like? Honestly, it boils down to the simple but difficult behavior change. I'm trying to get people to stay curious just a little bit longer and to rush to action and advice just a little bit slower. And it sounds straightforward, but it's actually pretty hard, in part because people, and I'm talking to all the folks listening into the show, you are hardwired to be an advice-giving maniac. I mean, it's true. Somebody starts talking to you, and about 20 seconds in, you don't really know what's going on. You don't really know this person. You don't really know what the heart of the challenge is, but you've already got the idea about what they need to do to start fixing it. And you kind of stop listening, right? You're going, okay, yeah. I'm going to do the pretend listening thing. But now I'm just waiting for them to stop talking so I can interrupt them and tell them my really, really good idea. And this, Jim, this connects so nicely back to this whole piece around how do you make change happen? Because telling somebody what to do almost never works.
Right.
It just doesn't. I mean, it can on that kind of sport coach moment where you're going, here's a technical adjustment you need to do this more successfully. So sure, that technical refinement, tell them what to do. But in terms of helping people get new insights, helping people generate new wisdom, helping people actually do the kind of deep practice that leads to success, that kind of has to be self-motivated, self-generated. And that's where being more curious and really just having some better questions to ask is the secret to this. Being more curious can make all the difference.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think back to athletics. I think back to my wrestling career. And yeah, certainly my coaches, part of their role was to just tell me the tactics, right? And I just drill them until they become second nature and they work. But that curiosity that you're talking about is interesting because I remember getting to the point in my career, certainly that happened later in my college career, where one of my teammate, practice partner, would go into the wrestling room, into the practice room. There'd be nobody else there. And we would just be curious and we would explore. We would figure different things out. We'd get into situations where, like I'm struggling with this, I'm having trouble with this position, and we would just work our way through it. And as we self-discovered and asked ourselves questions and asked each other questions, well, if you do it this way, does it work? Or how's it feel when I adjust this way or put pressure this side? And we would come up with solutions, and those solutions were much more, became much more hardwired more quickly because we discovered them. And I actually somebody just emailed me an article about 4 or 5 days ago. It was about productive failure. There was a piece of this article called Productive Failure, and it was about letting students actually. I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, so I'll bring this back. But it was about productive failure and students, how they learn more. They actually tested better on things when they were first given the problem and allowed to try to solve it themselves first and fail.
Exactly.
And then given the solution afterwards, and then they reapplied, and then they learned much better than rather than hearing the solution, hearing how to do something, and then having to memorize that and try to then apply. It worked better doing it the other way around. And so what you're talking about is staying curious, asking questions. Why does that work?
Yeah, it's a question of how brains work, and how our brains work. What makes our brains so amazing is the neural connections in our brain. And here's a piece of science around it. When you tell somebody what to do, when you give them advice and you're scanning their brain in an fMRI machine or whatever it might be, honestly, not a whole lot happens to the electrical activity in the brain. It just keeps humming along. And to everybody listening, just think how much advice you get on a daily basis. And then just think how much you ignore of that advice because it's not very good advice. And then the advice you do follow, think about how kind of disappointing so much of that is in terms of outcomes. Honestly, that's how people feel about your advice as well. When you ask a great question, and not all questions are equal, but if you ask a question that creates that aha moment, that moment where you can see the physical reaction, kind of their eyes look up to the ceiling. There's that hesitation because now that you can actually see their brain working it out, you can actually see the new neural pathways being connected, being formed in people's brains. So, Jim, you get to the end of one of your wrestling matches. It's the second year, so you lose. You're gutted because, you had this goal, you had this ambition. You got two ways of reflecting on that. The first is your coach says, Jim, this is what you did wrong. The second is your coach goes, Jim, let's debrief this. What do you think happened here? What did you learn from this? What would you do differently next time? And what else would you do differently? What do you know now that you didn't know before? And what you're doing is you're now figuring this out. Now, this is not to say that the coach would never say, I love all of this, Jim. Here's what I'd also add to it. You're just resisting the rush to give advice right away, because the more you let the other person do, the more powerful the learning actually is. Because when it comes down to it, and this isn't just for managers or leaders, it's for anybody who interacts with other human beings, helping people learn can be so powerful. Asking great questions is the great catalyst for learning. And it's not to say never give advice. It's just to say, can you just wait a little bit, see what they can figure out for themselves? And it means that when your advice does come, it's even better. It's even more to the point, and it's certainly better heard.
Yeah, I've seen this and experienced this so many times, and you're really making it very concrete and sort of bubble up to the surface. And the best stuff always is the best books, the best content, the best advice is always that stuff that you realize, yeah, that's so true, and it's almost obvious. But now, when you put it in your very black and white concrete terms, it just makes so much logical sense. I've read over the years just lots and lots of books. One of them being maybe my favorite book is the classic book by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And one of the things he talks about in there is be genuinely interested. Be genuinely interested in other people. And that's that curiosity you're talking about. And he also talks about ask questions instead of giving direct advice or giving direct orders or something like that. And I think back and I remember when I learned that and it changed how I sort of operated with my kids and with my wife and with people I was coaching at the time, et cetera. And now I've also recently read a book called How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen and Listen So Your Kids Will Talk. And so much of it's such a great book. And for me, it's desktop reference. I'll never get rid of this book because it's just something I always go back to. But again, a lot of it is about asking the right questions. And so for the manager or the coach or the parent or the entrepreneur out there listening to this right now, what are the right questions? How do I – let's say they're sitting there going, okay, I get it. I'm in. I believe you. I'm sold.
Give
now
me something
what?
Practical, man.
Right.
Stop talking, rabbiting on. Give me something useful.
Right.
So in the Coaching Habit book, we say, look, if you have 7 good questions, you're going to go a long way with just 7 questions. It's not about having 400 at your fingertips. It's like have a few really good questions and practice asking them so you get really good at asking them. So let me give you 3 questions from the 7 that I think could be really powerful for people. The first is, it's actually the second question that shows up in the book. We call it the focus question. And the key insight for this is the first challenge that shows up that you're trying to solve is probably not the real challenge. It's just the first challenge.
Right.
But because we're so wired to leap in, give advice, rush to action, we tend to get seduced by this first challenge that shows up. So the focus question is this: what's the real challenge here for you? What's the real challenge here for you? And how that's constructed really matters, Jim. You can see I could have asked, so what's the challenge here? And that would have given a certain type of answer, probably a bit glib, a bit shallow.
Yeah, superficial,
right?
Yeah,
I could have asked, what's the real challenge here? And already that's a more powerful question. That's an upgrade because you're sort of saying there's a range of challenges here. What's the real challenge? But the question really gets kind of its mojo when you add for you on the end. What's the real challenge here for you? In the context of that wrestling debrief, that imaginary wrestling debrief, I could have said, Jim, what's the challenge here with you losing? And you'd have gone, the training, the ref, the ring, the lycra, I don't know. I'm not a wrestler, so I'm just making stuff up.
Yeah, those are all good points,
I could have said, okay, what's the real challenge here in terms of getting to the next level? And you're like, it's about something, my training, my coach, something more personal. You'd have had to wrestle with that. But what's the real challenge here for you would have taken us potentially into somewhere really interesting. You're like,
no question.
You know what? it's my mindset. It's my anxiety about never having beaten somebody in the top 5. It's the fact that I don't secretly believe I can get to that next level, and I've got to do some more kind of stuff around the mental side of it. And that's a far juicier place for us to have gone.
Yep. Yeah.
So that's question number 1. What's the real challenge here for you? Question number 2, and this might be the question people want to take away from this, because it's a universal question. In the book, we call it the best coaching question in the world. And it is this: and what else? Because the insight is people's first answer is never their only answer, and it's rarely their best answer. So I go, Jim, what's the real challenge here for you around getting to the next level with wrestling? And we get a great answer, and I go, great. And Jim, what else? What else is a real challenge? And Jim, what else is a real challenge? And Jim, is there anything else that's a real challenge? And I can go, okay, so these are all great. All of these answers are great, but what's the real challenge here for you? And you can see that with just 2 questions, I've taken us down to quite a deep level and actually having a self-reflection and wisdom and new ideas being generated. And then the third question, Jim, if I was to only offer up 3, would be the very final question in the book, the learning question. Because the impact you can have as a parent, as a coach, as a teacher, as a manager, as a human being is helping people learn. And you need to understand how people learn. People don't learn when you tell them stuff, and they don't learn when they do stuff. They learn when they have a moment to reflect on what just happened. So at the end of the conversation, I could say, okay, this has been a great conversation, Jim. Here's the learning question. What was most useful or most valuable here for you? And 2 things happen. The first is Jim goes, okay, I didn't even realize that was a useful or valuable conversation, but now I have to extract the value from it. So you figure stuff out that you might otherwise have missed. And secondly, I get feedback. So I know next time I talk to you what was most useful or most valuable last time, so I can put a bit more weight on it the next time we happen to talk.
Yeah. Wow, these are incredible questions. And for the listener, I recommend checking out the book because, again, it has in there the kickstart question, the focus question, the strategic question, the foundation question. He has a lot of these sort of examples. I mean, we're just scratching the surface at the value that you can get if you learn the coaching habit. And like you said, you can do this in 10 minutes a day, right? So for the person, for the manager who wants to start doing this in 10 minutes a day, or maybe doing this on some sort of regular basis, is this is this a good place to start? You know, what's the real challenge here for you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, the way the book is written is it's like, okay, we've got 7 questions, and the first chapter is actually all about habits. How do you build a good habit? I know that's something that you're passionate about, which is helping people build habits that make a difference. Because habits are the building blocks of change. There's no point in failing if you don't do something differently next time. So what are the habits you want to build to get around failure or avoid failure or find the next type of failure to be successful? So it doesn't, I'm honestly like, I don't mind which question you pick. Pick one of my 7, pick another question, but just pick a question and start finding a way to make it a habit. If you backed me into a corner and said you have to choose a question, I'd be going, and what else? Mm-hmm. Just practice asking, and what else? Ask a question and then go, okay, after I've asked one question, rather than responding to their first answer, I will always say, and what else? And just see how that goes and how that shifts the type of conversations that you have.
For the listener, you've heard me talk about Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, in terms of sort of personally my favorite book, and just a book that has changed how I relate to people and how it's impacted every area of my life. I think I really, truly, honestly think, Michael, what you're doing is at the same level, because it changes not only this isn't just good for managers. This is good for, if you're having a debate with your spouse. What's the real challenge here for you? Or what's the real challenge here for us? And what else? I mean, think about how deep that goes. Think about how that can change your relationship with your spouse, with your kids, if they're struggling with anything, any of the myriad things that children and adolescents and teenagers can struggle with, or grown adult children. Like, what's the real challenge here for you? And man, that just how deep that goes right away.
Honestly, I mean,
change people's lives.
Well, I'm biased because I wrote the book, but when I wrote it, I went, look, I'm writing this for busy managers. That's who my kind of target audience is, in part because that's who our company currently serves. We help busy managers and organizations. But really, I'm going, look, if you're a human being that interacts with other human beings, I think this might be able to help you.
Yeah. Yeah, I very much agree. So how did you come across this? How did you discover this? Was it because you were mentored by a coach, or you learned this from another coach that you said, he's doing something here, or she's doing something here that I think I can really, make something of, or really bring to the surface and explain this? I mean, how did this come about?
Well, I don't know if you've ever heard the quote, Jim, inspiration is when your past suddenly makes sense. But it's a great way of going, that's why I know the stuff I know. That's why I care about the stuff that I care about. That's how I ended up here right now. So, when I was a teenager at high school and then into university, I did telephone crisis counseling, helping teens in crisis, suicide kind of stuff. And that was my first introduction to learning how to ask a question and help people to explore whatever was going on for them. And then when I was living in England, it was kind of when coaching first started to come to people's attention. And honestly, when you're in England, you look at it and you go, okay, this is just a weird Californian thing that's happening. We'll wait and see what happens. But, I was intrigued and I was like, okay, I'll keep an eye on that. And when I first moved to the US and I lived in Boston for a while, that's when I hired my first coach. So I go, what does this feel like? What do they actually do? And I started talking to my current clients and going, let's call this a coaching conversation rather than a consulting conversation. And then when I finally started doing my certification, I did my formal coach training. One of the things that I noticed is that when you looked at the people who were great teachers and great facilitators, what I loved were the questions that they asked. So I started collecting questions. And, when I came to writing this book, I was like, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to call it the 498 questions that everybody should know. And I wrote a version of the book which was not 498, but it was probably, 150 questions. And, honestly, it was just a terrible book. It was unreadable and useless. So I then went through this process of going, okay, so I know you had as one of your guests, Greg McEwen, and essentialism. And that's such a powerful way of thinking about life, which is what's the least, what's the minimum, what's at the heart of what I need to do. And in some ways I applied some of that philosophy to writing this book. I was like, what's the shortest book I could write that would still be useful? Because, there are so many books out there and so many of them are kind of a few good ideas with a whole lot of fluff built around them. And I was like, I want every page of this book to be valuable and useful. So what's the shortest book I could write? And so I played with questions. I went down to 3, I went up to 5, I went to 11, but in the end, 7 became the one that felt like the right number.
Yeah, well, you've come up with 7 exactly, perfect questions that I think we can all use. So
thank you.
Let's talk about getting real specific and actionable in terms of the short term here. So my listeners like to walk away with something they can do in the next, let's say, 24 to 48 hours that they can do to start moving towards their goals or to make themselves better.
Well, If you buy into the conversation Jim and I have had about the power of coaching and the power of staying curious a little bit longer and rushing to action and advice just a little bit slower, the 2 things that you might think about doing is, 1, see if you can start noticing how quickly you want to start giving people advice. It's how quickly your head gets filled with the answer that needs to be told them, because that's when you start to have the impetus for behavior change. If you want to try something more specific, I'd say pick one of these questions. Google the coaching habit. You'll find the 7 questions. Pick one of those questions. It could be one of the 3 I talked about. It could be one of the other 4. And go, okay, focus on just one. And so let's see if you can ask that once or twice or 3 times in a day and see what happens. Try that out. So that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, that's great. And you talk. There's a quote somewhere in your book that I read it said, "The minute we begin to think we have all the answers, we forget the questions." So I forget who that's attributed to, but it's such a great quote. And so, a little bit about you. Let me ask you this question about you. You've built an amazing company, an amazing brand. You're a published author. You're a Rhodes Scholar. What are some of the habits that you feel that you've done that have helped set you apart and helped you achieve success?
Jim, I'm so good looking and so talented that I don't actually need regular habits.
That's the obvious, but let's just go beyond that even.
I'll tell you a habit that's been really important for me, and it kind of plays into our conversation about structure that we had earlier. And it's this. For the last 10 years, I've had a mastermind group. We call it a brain trust. 5 other people. And we check in with each other somewhere between 3 and 6 times a week on a little, web board. Just going, hey, here's what I'm up to. We talk on the phone twice a month for about 90 minutes, where one of us will go, here's what I'm wrestling with. Can you help me out? And we meet once a year for 3 or 4 days to kind of do deeper work, to do planning for the year ahead. And what's been brilliant about these 4 or 5 other people is that they just know me extremely well. And it means that I can't get away with anything. They know all of my patterns. They know all of my tricks. They know all of my misdirections, and they don't fall for anything anymore. So having that regular form of accountability, not in the sense of feeling that they're checking up on me, but feeling that I have these people who are on my side, who are regularly going, hey, how's it going? And you combine that with the fact that I've had, when I started coaching, I'm like, I should have a coach of my own. And I went through probably 6 or 7 coaches really quickly because they just weren't a good fit for me. But then about 7 years ago, we came across Ernest Oriente, who's my coach. thepowerhour.com is his website. And he also is one of these people who just very good at not falling for my self-deprecating Australian charm and just going, you know what, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire in a kind of loving and compassionate way. And so these are habits that are less me relying on myself, but more going, I've just set up some really good structures that keep me coming back to the path I'm trying to walk.
So the listener, again, you've heard me talking about mastermind groups before. I have one that I'm a part of. I facilitate several others. And they're just another way to implement what I call the productive pause. And the productive pause is what I define it as a short period of focused reflection around specific questions that leads to clarity of action and peace of mind. And it's so fascinating, Michael. I ask that question to most of my guests. I get around to that question on almost every single interview. And it's always some form of pause. It's meditation, it's journaling, it's being part of a mastermind group or having a coach. And it's interesting. So you take these 3 or 4 days a year, right? And how many of you, the listeners and myself, said, 3 or 4 days, I can't take 3 or 4 days. But it's this pause, it's this short period throughout the year of a few days that you set aside where you pause. And let me guess, you probably get more done and more of the right things done because of that pause. Am I right?
Yeah, because, I'm expert at filling my days up with busy stuff.
Sure, we all are.
It's easy. I'm expert at going, look, I crossed off 97 things off my to-do list today. But how easy is it to actually kind of sink into understanding how you want to show up in this world and who you want to be and how you're getting in your own way and what real ambition and kind of your deepest dreams might be? How often do you get to access that? It's really hard because if you're not doing it with somebody else, you'll always find a reason to kind of slightly avoid the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I highly recommend checking into mastermind groups and checking into getting a coach and finding that time for you, the listener, to journal or meditate or get a coach. Do that productive pause. You get so much more and more of the right things done when you do that. Michael, what would be outside of your own books, which I'm going to have a link to for the listener. I'm going to have the link in the action plan for both of his books. So jimharshawjr.com/action to get access to those or get those two links to Michael's books. But is there another book that you might be able to recommend, Michael?
I read a lot during the year, and very few of them make it onto my shelf. I'll tell you two books that I've enjoyed recently. They offer different solutions. There's one by a guy called Bill Taylor. He's actually one of the founders of Fast Company, and his new book is called Simply Brilliant, and it's stories of what organizations are doing that are allowing them to succeed. But what's great about them is that they're not the Silicon Valley type of organizations, because we all get a bit overwhelmed by, you either have to be in New York or San Francisco or Silicon Valley to be cool and successful and really innovative. And what Bill's done in his Simply Brilliant book is actually find all sorts of different regular organizations and go and look how they're being extraordinary. So I think that's pretty cool. So if you're interested in that bigger picture, that could help.
Very cool.
If you're just helping deal with your kind of everyday busy life, Jocelyn Glee, which is spelled Glei, has a book out called Unsubscribe. And it's a very practical, very smart way of going, here's how you deal with being overwhelmed by your email. So if you have an inbox that is got emails dating back to 2004 in it, and you're like, God, I've got to, one day I will deal with this, that's the book I would recommend as your best resource for now.
Yeah, excellent. Great recommendations. I'll have links to those in the action plan for the listener. Again, jimharshawjr.com/action. Michael, I feel like we could talk all day long. I don't think the listener would listen all day long, but certainly they would listen to you, maybe not me. But can you tell the listener where they can find you, follow you, and what else kind of you have going on right now?
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you. So if you're curious about the book at all, thecoachinghabit.com, very straightforward URL. Even if you're not interested in the book, but you're like, maybe there's some free stuff, there's a ton of free stuff. You can pillage that website, videos, downloads, all sorts of stuff. So help yourself there at thecoachinghabit.com. If you're interested in the programs we run, and we really serve practical coaching skills for busy managers. Our clients are typically organizations and institutions. Box of Crayons, all one word, .biz, B-I-Z or B-I-Z, depending on where you live in this world. And the place I tend to hang out most on social media is on LinkedIn. I'm the only Michael Bungay Stanier in the entire universe, and therefore the only one on LinkedIn as well. So you will find me there if you look.
Excellent. And for the listener, again, I'll have links to everything he just mentioned there in the action plan. So make sure you grab those. Michael, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Look, it's been a real pleasure, Jim. Thanks for your time today.
Likewise. And for the listener, until next time, take the time to get clear on your goals and embrace failure as a stepping stone on your path to success.